Well, good evening from Singapore, good morning New York, and good afternoon to those of you joining us from Europe. For those of you that I've not had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Magnus Renfrew. I'm co-founder of ArtSG, a new art fair for Singapore that will welcome 95 of the world's leading galleries, and which is supported by our lead partner, UBS. On behalf of the whole ArtSG team, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion, the latest in our ArtSG times UBS discussion series that addresses key issues in today's art world. Today's discussion will last around 40 minutes or so, and we'll leave some time at the end for questions, so please do feel free to submit questions through whichever platform you're watching us on. If you're joining us on Facebook, we would encourage you to submit questions as a comment on this live video. And if you're watching us from our website, there is a submission link right above the video, the live video, to submit questions via a Google form. Today's discussion is quite literally ArtSG times UBS, and I'm delighted that joining me today to discuss issues surrounding corporate collecting, we have the global head of the UBS Art Collection, Mary Rozell. Mary is an internationally renowned curator, art expert, and author whose book, The Art Collector's Handbook, The Definitive Guide to Acquiring and Owning Art, enjoyed the publication of its second edition late last year. Mary, it's a delight to have you to join us. Welcome.
Thank you, Magnus. Great to see you.
Yeah, great to see you. And thank you so much for joining us so early your time. I know it's very early in the morning in New York, so thank you very much.
Thanks.
And before we get into our discussion, Mary has kindly agreed to provide the conversation with some context by giving us a brief overview of the UBS Art Collection. So Mary, getting straight into it, and without further ado, over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Magnus. Let's dive right in. I thought it would be helpful to just give some background on the structure and the history of the UBS Art Collection, which is quite unique in a number of ways. So let's start with the first slide, please, if we can. This slide shows the 4 different pillars. UBS, the structure of UBS, it's not just the art collection. There are 4 different, what we call pillars, art platforms for art at UBS. The art collection is 60 years old, and it's one of the oldest collections, corporate collections. And it's really what gives UBS the kind of credibility in the art space. It's the foundation of everything we do in the art space. We also have the art sponsorship platform, which is well known. Sponsors, we are the main sponsors since almost 30 years of Art Basel. That would be Art Basel in Miami, in Hong Kong, and in Basel itself. And in addition to that, we have an art advisory group based in Zurich. And we have something called the Art Dialogue, which is an educational platform where we host seminars, thought leaders from the international art world to come together with clients and employees in a space we have outside of Zurich, a beautiful space. So those are the 4 components of art at UBS. And the next slide, if we could have the next slide, please, it shows a little bit of our history. So the roots of the UBS Art Collection were formed in the 1960s. UBS is unusual in that our collection is made up of a number of different collections that have merged together over many decades. So, and 3 of those are predominant. One was the Union Bank of Switzerland, which merged together with the Swiss Bank Corps in 1998, forming UBS. And then the third image shows a work from the Paine-Weber collection. Paine-Weber collection may not be familiar to those in Asia, I'm not sure, but it was a huge deal here in the United States. It was the leading art collection throughout the 80s and 90s. And that was largely due to Don Marin, who was the CEO. He was the legendary CEO of Paine-Weber, and he was a phenomenal art collector, all the way into his 90s. Sadly, Don passed away 2 years ago, but we remained in close contact with him. He had a big impact on me as a young professional going into the art world. And I think what we have and what makes UBS such a formidable collection are these strong European roots, which are, very much art was, much more invested in the public sector, in government, much more part of business life over decades. And then we have this very dynamic private sector, private individual, maverick CEO, which would be more typical of an art collection, the corporate art collections, taking risks and building a truly exceptional and today valuable collection. So those three components form today's collection, and they were formally united in 2004, and we've kind of taken it from there. And then the next slide, please, just shows some basic facts and figures about the collection. We have 30,000, really 32,000 plus artworks in the collection, and our artworks are located in over 700 offices around the world. So what was once a European, Swiss, American bank is now very much a European bank. I have a team of 10. We are located in 5 locations around the world: Zurich, New York, London, Frankfurt, and Hong Kong. One of the first things I did when I joined the firm in 2015 was to open a Hong Kong office for the art collection. It was very obvious and important that we needed someone on the ground in Asia, and it's made a huge difference for us. And it has been, a main part of our collecting focus over the last few years. We also have a list here of some of the more established artists and some of our recent acquisitions of the last few years. The list of established artists, I should note, and we'll get into this, they were not necessarily established when we acquired their works. We're acquiring at a very different level, which we'll talk about. And structurally, the UBS Art Collection belongs to the corporate and branding department at UBS. That wasn't always the case. And we have an art board that sits in Zurich and governs all art at UBS in terms of making sure all of these different platforms, are aligned and that things, are going in the right direction. So lastly, we have a slide just showing some of the artwork displays. Most of our artworks are on display. Unlike a museum, we don't keep a lot in storage. So they are in the offices around the globe. And those are just a sample of some of the artworks. So you can take it from there, Magnus. That's the general overview.
Well, thank you very much, Mary,
for this discussion.
For providing some context. That's great. So I guess my first question is, often, as you sort of indicated, corporate collections are driven by sort of a singular vision by an owner or CEO who has a particular passion for things. And so it can be quite a personal vision. And sort of coming into it as you did with a very established collection, bringing all these things together. So how did you sort of start to go about working through a plan of transition from sort of perhaps a personal vision of a CEO, an owner-occupier vision, as it were, to a more corporate vision?
That's a great question. I was familiar with the Payne Weber collection and some of the works there. But when I started, of course, it's completely overwhelming. You've got 30,000 artworks, most of which I still haven't seen 6 years in because they are all over the world. You can see them in a database. But the first question was, what is this collection really? And what are we going to do with it? What are the next steps? So, the first thing we did was we actually published a book in 2016 called To Art Its Freedom, which kind of was a lens on this collection. And part of it was an exercise for me to understand the collection. We had an outside curator come in. And what's so interesting is we are collecting the art of our time. This has been going on for 60 years, but it's only when time passes that you can understand the collection and you see how each decade of collecting from the 1960s captured the zeitgeist of that period. But what was also evident, as was the case with many collections, was that the collection had a heavy emphasis on Western male artists, right? So, and that was, European American collecting, and it wasn't a reflection of the objectives of the bank. It was a reflection of the art market at the time. So, like many other collections, the task was at that point, how do we even this out? Geographically, gender-wise, ethnic-wise, and that's what we've set out to do. And I have to say, when we're collecting, we're not buying an artwork because it represents diversification in itself, right? We're always buying for the merits of that artwork. And the market has changed so radically now too. So that makes things so much easier in some ways, but also harder because the competition is greater to get these works.
And sort of talking about I think that you bring up such an interesting point. It's been such a reflection of the wider art world in the last 12, 18 months about the diversity and inclusivity and just reflecting different genders and ethnicities and so on in terms of the art market. And how has that sort of impacted on your collecting and your collecting strategy? Has that led to a reflection in terms of your own activities, as it has, I think, for everyone?
Yeah, I'd say yes. The mission of the collection, so many corporate collections collect according to theme. Often that theme is related to the corporate operations themselves. A friend of mine, for example, runs a corporate art collection in Germany, which is basically, it's called ADAC. It's everybody who owns a car. It's like we have AAA. It's a car ownership thing. So they collect art related to transportation, and then it was expanded to motion. So, so these different corporations have different themes. Deutsche Bank started collecting works on paper, predominantly from German artists. But for UBS, it's always just been the art of our time. What does that mean? Right? And it's the compelling issues of our day. And so we often don't know why we're collecting something, when we're collecting it. It's just something that seems very relevant, incredibly exciting. But stepping back, since I've been here, we definitely have collected a lot of work by Black artists. That is particularly in the United States with everything that's been going on here. This is a huge theme. The market has shifted dramatically. And for us, it's just what's interesting and beautiful and compelling at this moment. We also have collected works, broadly geographically, a lot of Asian artworks, as I mentioned. And another theme that's come up, of course, is sustainability and technology. And sometimes those two are wed. Not just artists using technology to create art, but somewhat hijacking technology to, for their investigations in their art. So, artists like Trevor Paglen using artificial intelligence, Irish artist Richard Moss, using high-tech surveillance photography to create his works that address what's going on in the environment. And so those are kind of themes that have emerged. So we're just kind of in the thick of it in what's going on now. And that pretty much steers our collecting. And I'm sure in 10 or 20 years, there'll be an analysis of what we're doing. But that's pretty much the approach.
Well, over the last few decades, you've had some good hits. And it'd be interesting, you talk about collecting art of our time and being in the thick of it. What are the things that you're looking for really in terms of the artworks that you're collecting?
Well, I have to start by saying collecting art for a corporation, while it's very similar to private collecting, it's also different in that, as I said earlier, our artworks are displayed in a workplace. So first and foremost, there's a materiality consideration, right? So we're not in a museum. We don't have necessarily the conditions that you need to preserve very delicate artworks or crazy installations. we also work very closely with our real estate department, when we're building a building, to try to get, UV protection on the windows and certain things built in. But there's a certain sensitivity for materiality. We want something. Most of the works we collect are two-dimensional. Then there are certain limitations on subject matter. People have to work with this art each day, so it can't be too violent or upsetting, too sexual. So, and also there's size limitations. Most of our artworks are hanging in conference rooms, in client-facing spaces. So you have those limitations to begin with. And then we are looking for artworks really that are going to enhance the existing collection. One of the fun things is to, have this vast collection, but we usually, when we buy a new work, we talk about how it connects to other works in the collection. And then if it's something completely different, and this is why I don't like categories so much, because we don't know what's coming up next. We talk about how this work enhances what we have and continues kind of the themes and our purpose. So those are kind of the things that we're looking for. And then really it's about the availability, access, competition. It's not easy to get the works that you want. So we, often we're waiting for even a few years, waiting for that right piece to come up. We also, if we're really excited about an artist, a lot of times you get offered material that you don't think is the best work of that artist. And, it's tempting to tick that box, say, yes, we have this artist in the collection. But we have tried to be quite disciplined in holding off and waiting for the right piece, which does take discipline, right? And there's a lot of, you want a great work. You see collections out there that have every name that you recognize every name, but the quality of the works isn't really stellar. So a lot of things to think about. It's a big responsibility.
Yeah, I'm sure. And I mean, in terms of the stage of the career that the artists that you tend to focus on, is there, are you looking mainly at sort of mid-career artists that already have established a reputation and have an exhibition history, or are you really looking at younger artists and emerging artists as well?
I'd say the niche is emerging to mid-career. We're not buying directly out of art schools. We want to see a few shows under an artist belt with some critical reviews, some good feedback. And, up until mid-career generally. Sometimes we'll do some gap filling. Certain artists, scratching our heads, why is this artist not in the collection? And usually those artists are too expensive to buy now. We're not buying at the blue chip level ever, even though we have blue chip works in our collection. And it's one of the most enjoyable things for me is to go through old invoices from the 90s, from the 80s, and see what was paid, and just to trace the thinking of what happened in the past. And you could see, for example, we have a couple tremendous pockets of depth in our collection, one of which are works by Ed Ruscha. We have 63 works by Ed Ruscha, and we also have 54 works by Lucien Freud, which is quite amazing. And both of those bodies of work have been widely exhibited. Most recently, the Louisiana Museum showed our Ruscha works. We had a wonderful show there, and the Martin Gropiusbau in Berlin, where Freud was born, showed our works by Freud. And you see
the Royal Academy, I think, as well. Is that correct?
Pardon?
I can't remember. Did you share works with the Royal Academy in London for the Freud show? I can't remember.
Yes, we're also an active lender. So in that case, we did lend an important portrait to that work. But the other two shows I mentioned were only UBS works, shows dedicated to them. But you see all of a sudden Don Marin getting rabidly interested in these artists and buying as much as he could. And that's something that I envy, not being the CEO of a company, because sometimes to be a great collector, you have to be a little bit crazy, right? And you have to take these risks. And a corporate environment by nature is almost anti-art in some ways, right? Because corporations generally want formulas, they want certainty, they want strategies, right? That word is used so much. What is your strategy for collecting? And the first time I was asked that, I really didn't know how to answer, because I didn't know what it meant, honestly, right? And now we've kind of fitted in. But collecting does not happen by a formula per se, right? And as you know, there's absolutely no certainty at all. But you do have to take risks at times, and you have to be very educated. And that's, Don Marin was a case where he was in the galleries every weekend, voraciously reading, and he had a superb eye. So he knew when there was opportunity, right? He knew what to buy. He did make mistakes, which he would readily say. But yeah, it's all part of that process. And to your point earlier, many of these collections, corporate collections, particularly in the United States, were driven by these CEOs who were collectors and brought their passion into the workplace. And a lot of those collections didn't survive past the CEO's tenure. And that's one of the unique things that UBS has. And I think that's one of the great strengths, as I mentioned earlier, this European tradition of being committed to artworks over decades that has allowed the collection to endure and flourish.
And in terms of sort of pulling together those different strands and disparate strands of personal passions, and now sort of looking to the future in terms of how the future direction of UBS's art collection, sort of what do you feel is going to be sort of key drivers and key considerations for you in terms of the way forward for the collection?
I think, in terms of our collecting process and the things that we're looking for, I think that will pretty much stay the same. But the other aspect of this collection is it's not just buying the works, it's how we use the works. We call it the activation of the artworks. And certainly we have had a very, clear way in which we have wanted to use these artworks. And that involves sharing them with the public in all different ways. And also we have been very dedicated to artist commissions, which had a tradition at UBS in previous decades. We've kind of revived working closely with artists to create site-specific works. The other thing that's happened since the pandemic.
Just interrupt briefly, just to ask, so in terms of the site-specific works, what kind of context have you been looking for? Have they been within UBS's sort of real estate itself, or has it been instead?
Well, it started, going back to when I first started and was looking, what are the strengths of this collection? What is this collection? I was quite blown away to find a whole series of monumental, very, in some cases, experimental artworks in Switzerland that were created from the 1970s through up until about 2000. So each time there was a building, an artist would be commissioned to do something quite significant. And they were all artists of international stature. And you find them, like, we have this magnificent Solowit, this huge wall painting in, this kind of suburb of Lugano. And so in these relatively small cities throughout Switzerland, there are these incredible artworks that really have an impact on you when you see them. And so, that's something, and there's an amazing work. We did a whole, you would call it a Gesamtkunstwerk, really. It was a work with Carlos Cruz Diaz, the great Carlos Cruz Diaz, where he even designed the parking garages. He designed the whole building, top to bottom. It worked with the architects from the beginning. It was really something quite magnificent.
Where was that?
In the 70s.
And whereabouts?
Well, it's in Zurich, outside of Zurich. a small town, and actually the building was decommissioned at some point. And that's something that we have to think about when we do commissions, right? Because real estate is not always permanent. So we have had a few examples where we have been able to take components, work with the artists together. A good example is Sarah Morris. UBS did her first public commission around 2000 in Zurich. And I actually saw it in my first couple of weeks of work when I was over there. And then I learned that we were not going to, I don't think we owned that building, but in any case, the work was going to be decommissioned. And at some point I worked up the courage to go to Sarah and say, look, this is happening. And she understood, she was totally cool about it, that, because we own the artwork itself, whether it exists or not. So I asked her if she would reimagine this work for New York. Because the work itself had been inspired, works by her in the collection were inspired by our flagship in New York. So she came in and she recreated this artwork from 2001 in our flagship in New York. It's amazing. It faces the street. And so we do have to think about those things. But then how do we bring this forward? And as you know, Magnus, we do a lot of lounges for art fairs. We sponsor a number of art fairs. And we were shipping artworks all around the world for these fairs for a week. And, there's always concerns about, particularly the most valuable ones, concerns about damage and transit, the environment. And we started saying this is, in the more fairs we got involved with, the more artworks we were moving around. So the commissions really grew out of our fairs. We were thinking, wouldn't it be great to work directly with an artist to create something special for the fairs and see where that goes. So generally we commission artists for art fairs.
Yeah. And in terms of, you bring up the conservation issues, just in terms of the collections management, obviously we've talked a little bit about the acquisition side of things, but in terms of the management and upkeep, the reality and logistics of looking after 30,000 precious objects must be incredibly complicated. If you could talk us through that a little bit, I'd be really interested to hear what you have to say.
I'm glad you brought that up, Magnus, because that is, that's kind of the bread and butter of my team's work. It's a daily, and I think it's something that most collectors don't think about, in the heat and the passion of buying artworks. What is this going to cost, and what is it going to mean to care for these artworks? And, it's something that collectors don't necessarily like to think about. It's not the fun part in some ways, but that again is a big responsibility. We are constantly doing conservation work and just making sure that we have best practice across all regions with respect to framing. We work with security. There's the shipping, there is all the cataloging. We had to really upgrade our database because your information about your artwork is, where the value sits. You have to have that information. It has to be secure. It has to be comprehensive. It has to be updated. So there is a lot to think about. And sometimes there are not, you can really have conservation conundrums. And we have to work with artist studios or artist estates to figure out the right response and approach. It is endlessly interesting, though. It seems like it's the boring part of collecting, but there are so many interesting issues. And then the team also handles copyright issues, which can be quite complex. And going back to the artist commissions, an artist commission contract is also quite a complex legal document with many things to consider. It's of course, it's more challenging to do commissions. A number of things can go wrong and you don't necessarily know what you're going to get. You don't really know until you get it. So there's a lot to think about. And, I would say the team, I'm so impressed by my team. They all have advanced degrees in art and bring something different to the table. And, we have a couple people on the team that are on the risk committee, others, collection management, data, someone's in charge of the database. So everyone has their specialties in terms of collection management, but at a basic level, there's just a tremendous amount of knowledge needed to maintain the collection.
And I know that you're sort of keen to be engaged with the different geographies where the business is engaged, and just in terms of the kind of the scouting for new talent within those regions, and the collecting focus of including work from these different regions. Could you just tell us a little bit about how that operates, where you get your intel from?
Yeah, it's it is a challenge covering so much of the world, for sure. And basically it starts with the team funneling up information, and this happens on a daily basis. Everyone is out in their region seeing shows, people are reading, and someone like Louise on my team who sits in London, she's also responsible for Russia, she's responsible for the Middle East, she's responsible for Scandinavia. So there's a lot to think about. And like all art professionals, we use our free time, our vacations, we're always seeing art, we're always traveling. And then it's an exchange of information. And this information, like I said, it's funneled up every day, sharing links. We meet weekly and we have conversations. And then of course we have people, our networks, right, of people saying, look at this artist, and we use our network that we have built up as individual professionals over the years as sounding boards. Sometimes we do need higher level of expertise when we are investing. Say we bought a beautiful dinghy a few years ago, and we wanted to make sure that it was, so we went to the dinghy expert to say, what do you think of this? Is this, because that was a bigger investment for us. That was, we would have liked to have acquired his work much earlier, but it was a piece that we felt we should have in the collection. So sometimes we'll seek outside more formal advice in that way. Generally, we don't work with outside advisors per se. In the past, that was a practice. And what you find is that, an actually quite renowned curator was hired a few decades ago to buy work for the collection. And he bought tremendously important and interesting pieces, but we never showed a lot of them because they weren't the right size. They didn't work for our workplace in the end, right? So you have to have when we're buying artworks, we're not just buying them, we're thinking of a space, a project, a dialogue with other artworks, because most of the spaces in these branches around the world, they are curated. They have themes, they have, there's something going on there. So you can't just buy, we're not buying in a vacuum. We're buying for a specific purpose, for specific places. And that also adds to the challenge. It's really like putting together a big puzzle.
Yeah, and that sort of brings me on to another point. We've talked a little bit about the sort of the public engagement and UBS showing its own collection to the public, but also loaning parts of the collection to exhibitions where it's appropriate and relevant and so on. But in terms of the engagement of the collection with the staff itself, how does that operate, and how important is the staff engagement to the kind of the proposition of the UBS Art Collection?
Well, it's really important to us. I would say, when I think about it, there's 5 reasons. It's like, well, why do you have corporate collections, right? And first one would be the staff engagement. And I know that Don Marin, for example, he really wanted the staff to react to artworks. He wanted to have a dynamic workplace. He enjoyed it when people didn't like the art because it sparked discussion. And I do think that, from a branding perspective, having contemporary art hanging in your workplace creates a certain energy and makes a statement. My husband, it always struck me because he's a lawyer and he went into, one of these big law firms in New York as a younger person, and when he was just starting in his career, and they had this fabulous art collection, and he was shocked, and it really changed his perception of that law firm. And I think, that's part of it, the branding. We love the employee interaction. We love it when employees get attached to the artworks, get upset if we move it. We like to do programs for them, bring in artists at lunchtime. Now we're doing virtual programs, but their engagement means an awful lot to us. And it's also, again, opens up conversation. The second aspect of it's also just a real estate need, right? So we were in the real estate department, the art collection, because art is going on. You have to have something on the walls, and art is going on walls all around the world. So it also serves a real estate purpose. And then there's the public aspect. It was very important to us, corporate collections can be quite secretive. And certainly I always wanted to see the UBS Art Collection. I could never get to see it. And so it was important to us to open it up as much as possible. We do that through publications. We've done 3 books on the collection in the last few years. We do it through museum loans. At any given time, we always have a number of international loans out there, our own exhibitions. And our most, I'd say, the biggest step we took was opening a gallery for the public. It's our 1285 UBS Art Gallery, located in our flagship here in New York. And it's a great spot in the middle of Midtown, sandwiched between MoMA and Christie's. It's got a nice plaza surrounding it where people gather at lunchtime, and it's all windows, so the art faces out. And we look at that as an invitation for the public to come in free of charge every day that the building's open, Monday through Friday, right, from like 8 to 6. So that's been a wonderful thing, a tool to have to share our collection. And lastly, it's about client engagement for us. All of our artworks, unlike other corporate collections, the vast majority are hanging in client-facing spaces. They're not in employees' offices, which in today's world, offices are disappearing anyway. But they're there for the clients. And UBS is the largest wealth manager in the world. We have so many clients who are interested in art, who are collectors themselves. They love the art. And it's just, even for me personally, in my role, the conversations I have with our clients about art are so rewarding. They are so sophisticated and interested, have interesting lives themselves, and they bring so much to the table. So I think that, if you brought it down to one word as to why we have an art collection, it's about dialogue. It's about engagement, connecting to people, and conversation.
I mean, one of the key things for us as an art fair, and one of the key objectives, is to really expand the audience for art and to reduce the intimidation factor, and to make people feel entitled to have a kind of a starting point in terms of their journey. If you had any advice for somebody that hasn't yet got involved with art and is looking to take that first step on the collecting journey, what would be your advice to them?
Well, the main advice is to get out and see things. Not just online. Even though we have these great digital options now, it's so important to see artworks in person. They can have a completely different effect on you. And see things and do research, read, and then, listen, not follow these trends that we see out there. What is so-and-so buying? There's so much focus on auction records, right? And the market, and, and art investing and all of that at the moment. But I think that the best collectors over time have really listened to what spoke to them personally and thought about why, and, pursued their own path in collecting. I do think it's a personal journey, but also an educated journey is the best course, right? To make sure that you're paying the right price, to look at an artist's whole body of work, not just that work that you see at a fair and think would look great over your sofa. What is that artwork, and what is the greater body of work? And who is this artist? Sometimes we will discover a young artist and it looks great. It fits a number of objectives, the artwork, but then it's like, well, let's dig deeper And is this artist someone who's going to continue to evolve, right? So, yeah, research and looking.
Yeah, sort of really engaging properly with the fundamentals about what makes an artist tick, what's their motivation, what their background is, asking all those kinds of questions. In terms of the sort of the different kinds of collecting, obviously we've focused very much on corporate collecting today, but how would you see that corporate collecting, institutional collecting, and private collecting differ? That's not too broad a question.
I think they differ, they differ in, I guess I've already mentioned this, in terms of the limitations on corporate collection, and process, in terms of how collecting is done. Sometimes a corporation will have committees who decide on what's going to be acquired. So yeah, it's more about the display aspect, and I would say the process and the purpose. You can certainly do more things in your private space than you would in a corporation. I should add, I didn't mention, but quite fundamental to our collecting and our mission is that we only buy artworks on the primary market, meaning artists at the time of artworks at the time of their creation. And that's important to us because our mission is to support artists and the gallery system that is supporting the artists and the communities where we do business. So, if we're doing business in Latin America, we want to support galleries in Latin America, and not just buy Latin American artwork here in New York at auction, whatever. I mean, all of this artwork is available everywhere. So we are quite committed to buying artwork in that way.
Being part of the ecosystem.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in Asia currently, there's a huge burst of interest in collecting, both privately, but also in terms of corporate collecting. If you were to give some advice to those that are thinking about starting a corporate collection and deciding on a direction of travel for their strategy, what would be some of the key points that you would suggest to them in terms of their considerations?
Well, before embarking on such an endeavor, I would definitely say consider the cost, the holding costs of the collection. Consider all that before you get in, what it's going to cost.
Acquisition is just one part of the story.
Just one part of the story. So you got to see the whole picture.
Yeah.
And you see corporations that, smaller ones generally, who dive in and then want to get rid of their collection. It's too much or whatever. And another, it's not easy to sell artwork that is not at the masterpiece level, and to recoup your investment. So definitely think practically about it. I think the other aspect is to hire somebody really great, whether that's in-house or outside, depending on the resources. Make sure that the person who is in charge of acquiring art and building this collection is aligned with your values and has the credentials needed. And at the same time, give them latitude, right? Give them, if everything is going to be decided by committee, you're not going to get a great collection. You've got to trust your team, and give them the freedom to make decisions. As you know, Magnus, the art market moves so fast, and we don't have time within our team. Ideally, I would love to have consensus from my entire team, but with different time zones, there'll be an artwork, say that an artist that we've been looking at for a couple of years, and then you get the email, you get the offer, and sometimes you've got an hour to make a decision. And so you need to give the person in charge, I'm talking about the contemporary sphere, right? But freedom to act and make decisions. And of course, have certain checks and balances in place, but make sure that the vision is aligned, that you've got somebody who's competent. We have so many, the art world is so massive now, and every other person is a curator, every other person is an art advisor. And really look at those credentials and the track record and the history of the people that you're working with, and make sure that, that there's a shared vision.
So, we're coming towards the end of the time for our own discussion. We've got some great questions coming in, but before we go on to the questions from the audience, it would be great to just get a little bit about your own, little information about your own personal story and your own history and how you came to, with your career. And I know it's been quite diverse in terms of things that have happened prior to your role with UBS. So it'd be great if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, diverse is the word. I actually came into corporate collecting probably backwards. Most people in my position heading a corporate collection have been there for 20 years, 25 years. They've grown up in the collection, which is a great thing to have that institutional history. It's quite unusual for someone to come in late in the game like I have. And as you know, I am an art historian. My focus was German Expressionism. Then my career, and I'm also an art attorney, art lawyer. When I was thinking about my profession, I knew I wanted to go into the art field. I did not want to be a lawyer, but it was a time when a lot of museum directors, I thought I wanted to be a museum director. That was my aspiration. They were failing at notable institutions in the US because they didn't have the skills to run an institution. Mm-hmm. So I felt like, oh God, I've got to get this law degree. I didn't want to get a business degree. At least art law was intellectually stimulating. And then basically my career got derailed because I went to Berlin not long after the wall came down, and there was no way not to be there. And so I would say that I kind of grew up in the art world in Berlin and had a number of different roles. You know, I was the correspondent for the art newspaper. I did a lot of curating. I was everybody's go-to for their gallery contracts. I was one of the people who could write in English. So I had a lot of disparate work there. I worked for Bill Griesbach Auction House, and then I had to come home around 2000, which is a long time ago now. But through that, I got into collecting because I had this chance meeting with somebody who happened to be the CEO of a family office and thought that I would be the person to lead this incredible, massive private art collection. The next thing I know, that's what I was doing. She liked my European crazy background. And so, I got very steeped into this private collection. And even despite all my experience, my degrees, my knowledge, I didn't really know a lot about art insurance. I didn't know about humidity controls. And the collection was a great learning tool because it spanned many different eras. There was pre-Columbian art, there were post-war masters, there was Wiener Werkstätte, furniture, just amazing array, which I worked with so many experts. And then I really felt that there was a deficiency in the collecting field in terms of knowledge. So I was at Sotheby's Institute of Art running the art business program after that. And that's where I decided to set up a collecting course where you actually learn about collecting and art collection management. And out of that grew my book. And that's ultimately what led me to UBS, the corporate collection, the one aspect I hadn't covered yet. But long story, long journey, but here we are.
That's fascinating. Thank you. And I guess I've got two last questions for you. One of which I think is easy. The other one's maybe a little bit more challenging and irreverent. But the first one, starting off with the easy one, what really excites you most about engaging with contemporary art?
It's just that you're always learning. You're always learning. And I'm so thankful for that all the time. Every time I go out to see art, I'm so energized. And, it's that art is the one place where everything comes together, right? Your history, sociology, science, you're being challenged. And so it's never boring. And I really love that. Contemporary art's easy. It just never ends. So that's an easy.
Okay, so that's my easy one. And so moving on to the harder one. In your role, what is the question that you least enjoy getting asked, and why?
What do I think of NFTs? That's the recent question that we get every day. NFTs, everything's about NFTs. But what would be more general least favorite question? I think one thing that's tough about being in a position like this, you run a big collection, you work for a bank. So many artists come to us directly. So many people who know artists come directly. And, as I mentioned, we buy only through galleries on the primary market. And, often I will try to look at the artist's work. We can't buy the artist's work. It's not how we buy artwork. But it's, it's just, I care a lot about artists, and it's such a struggle. You have to be so brave to be an artist and take that risk to put yourself out there. It's so personal. There's no guarantees. There's not great chances of financial success. So it's, I do think, I find that kind of challenging. I don't like to turn artists away, put it that way. And there's so many. So it's how to be encouraging and be a support.
Great, thank you. So we've got some great questions coming in. So I think we should turn to the audience's questions for the last part of our discussion. The first question that we have, how does UBS evaluate the quality of art being produced during a short period, 5 years, and does it adapt its purchases accordingly? And my understanding of that question is that perhaps that's within a 5-year period of its creation. So like within a short time after its creation, how do you go about evaluating that work, and how do you adapt your purchasing plans accordingly?
Well, I think it's, we're looking for art that has a certain degree of quality, right? And quality is a whole big discussion, what constitutes quality, but also artwork that is saying something new, right? That is not, as we, redundant, as we say, an artist that is breaking new ground. And
I mean, just going on to that quality issue just for a second, I know that it's a huge topic, but maybe just to give an overview of some of the considerations in terms of quality, what turns you off about things, and what are things that perhaps excite you about an artwork? When one's thinking about quality, I know it's a very loaded term, but perhaps in what excites you about an artwork, what are the things that you're looking for?
Well, it is nice to see a certain degree of skill. And that's not always obvious. So I think it's very important to ask a lot of questions and learn about the artist's process. So many artworks, they look like, oh, that's a beautiful photograph or whatever, and you don't know what's behind it. And sometimes the meaning is in the process itself. And sometimes these processes, particularly using technology, new experimental technology, you can be kind of blown away by things that on their surface you may not understand, right? So you have to ask questions. Is this new? Is this interesting? And then we look at, kind of classical things like composition, talking about, an artist that, we know, we love, we know is important, we want in the collection, but maybe the work that you're offered just isn't as emblematic of the artist's work. It's not the right composition or even color. Like there is an aesthetic component as well. For us, I think we're quite aesthetically minded given our workplace. We don't just buy beautiful things, but there are certain, and I think when you look at art enough, you can walk into an exhibition by an artist and recognize what are the best works in that room, right? And of course it's subjective. But I do think there are qualities that are beyond subjective. So, and we are, we're looking for.
I think often when you are looking at an exhibition of an artist's work, if it's a solo presentation, I think that even people that have been looking at entering it and engaging with art for a first time can be drawn to certain works and compare and contrast why they prefer those works to other works in that
Yes.
exhibition quite instinctively. And so I think that you can quite often develop your own sense of criticality through that engagement in a way, surprisingly quickly. I have another question. Do corporate collectors care about historical sales records and potential gains? And what percentage of your portfolio is cap gain focused?
I should say we do not buy artwork for investment purposes. Yeah. So we're not interested in that, but we want to make good investments at the same time, right? And I think it's very important we have to be very careful about where that line is. You don't want to overpay for an artwork. Even if you don't have any plans to sell that artwork ever, you don't want to overpay. And it's, we, like everyone else, you're trying to get into the market at the right moment, right? When before the artist's work completely takes off, before they're established in most cases, in that sweet spot. There is, that being said, of course, our collection is incredibly valuable now. And I wouldn't be honest if I, didn't say that there is interest within the bank in the value, right? Sometimes that's the first question. We do work in a bank, and it's the orientation is towards numbers, right? So people are interested in the value and what that means. But it's not something that we're not interested in selling the works. We do sell some works, so I get that question a lot.
Yeah, I've got a question on that now, actually, if I might interrupt just briefly to put that to you. Does UBS have a practice of deaccessioning its artworks when they're no longer relatively inclined to its collection mission? And where or whom does UBS sell the deaccessioned artworks to? Does UBS donate deaccessioned artworks to non-profit organizations such as museums, for example?
Good question.
Yeah.
So yes, basically we sell artworks that we can't show anymore. Sometimes it's because they're damaged. Sometimes it's the size or subject matter, like the aforementioned artworks that the great curator acquired on behalf of the company. Sometimes the work, you see that, okay, this was more of a regional work bought by a local branch manager in Switzerland in the 1970s. That doesn't fit anymore. And so there's a range. Generally, the sales are at the lower level. And we do have staff sales, which is quite fun. Yes, the staff loves that. And so, and there's, if we can sell it at auction, it's usually like low regional, smaller regional auction houses where we will sell things. If they don't sell there, sometimes they'll go to the staff sale, but we also make a number of donations. On our staff sale, the money from our staff sale is donated to a local charity. And we do make donations to museums. Two recent examples, we had a Latin American work that we couldn't show in the collection. We were able to donate it to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which was amazing. Yeah, another example is we had a fantastic mural from the 1930s in Chicago. It was a maritime scene. It was a huge mural, and it was part of the building. We were selling the building, but also a 1930s mural about shipping doesn't really fit our collection anymore. So we were able to donate it to the Chicago Maritime Museum, where it belongs. And, so that's very satisfying we put a lot of thought into it. Where does this piece belong, and who would benefit from that? And, sometimes we will assist with the installation costs or whatever to get it to a museum and put it in the proper context. So there is a lot of care and thought to how we dispose of certain artworks. And sometimes they'll go to a local charity. Sometimes that's the most appropriate. So
I have two last questions for you, which we'll just try and tackle quite quickly because we're running out of time. But how does UBS assess how much capital should be allocated to art? I'm not sure how fully to answer that question, but maybe if you can give it a stab.
We've had pretty much set budget since I've been in my tenure. So we have an annual budget each year. And sometimes that will be supplemented by a special project that's going on. And we tend to work within that budget. And our collecting is kind of two-tiered, because we'll have these very small offices. I'm thinking of the United States, Switzerland, lots of branches all around. So in that case, we're buying a lot of prints, right, that might be appropriate for this office in the Midwest or whatever. And then there's really the collection building, right? Looking at more substantial pieces, unique pieces that you see as part of a bigger legacy. The prints are also, but everything is aligned. The prints are also part of it, right? But then, you know, the challenge is to break up our budget from the beginning of the year to cover all the projects that we have, the real estate projects, the fairs. And you can't plan ahead of time because you don't know where the opportunity is going to be. So yeah, it's interesting once we get to this time of year and, you know, we've spent a good amount of our budget and trying to figure out, we have to be, you know, strategic in how we use these funds.
And the last question, which is, has just come through, which is within the context of the art world, what are some of the dynamics that excites you most at the moment?
I think, you know, for me, there's two things I would say are really exciting. One is the level of interest in collecting. And I love that the art world has become so democratized through digitization. I love that artists are, you know, selling work through Instagram, and collectors of all ages and backgrounds, or even non-collectors, just individuals feeling like they want art and they can enter this market. So I think that is a wonderful development. And secondly, all of this change is just fascinating. I mean, NFTs I mentioned, even though it's not my favorite subject to talk about, it is very fascinating what's happening right now on that front. And all the structural changes happening in the art market when you have these very large dealers in the United States joining together to form one gallery. You have these crossovers of museum people going into the auction houses, and all the, you know, digital platforms that are coming up. I mean, it is really hard to keep up with the changes, and all different people coming into this art world, this market, monetization, tokenization of artworks. Yeah, there's just so much going on. So it's endlessly interesting. At the end of the day, though, I feel quite traditional in terms of, I just love looking at art and learning about art, and you know, appreciate all these new things happening, and I want to know about them. But I think collecting at its core remains what it is, right?
Well, Mary, thank you so much for your time. It's been wonderful to catch up and to hear your very elucidating insights. And, you know, I feel that we could go on for hours, and I hope that we'll have another opportunity to have a part two of the discussion at some point, because I think there's so much ground still to be covered. But thank you very much indeed for your time. And thank you to everybody for joining us from around the world. Thank you so much for all your great questions as well. It's always brilliant when on these panel discussions that we get such good questions. So thank you very much indeed for those. And we very much look forward to welcoming you to the inaugural edition of ArtSG in January. Thank you very much indeed.